Well, welcome back, all you VITA volunteers. In our last session, we discussed the intake and interview process and then how to determine filing status. In this session, we're going to pick up with describing what an ITIN is and then how to determine dependency status and discuss a few specifics about Arizona dependents. So with that, let's take it away. Okay, that was filing statuses. So now let's look at a couple of other things here too. What is an ITIN? And I'm going to go over this fairly quickly. We don't see a lot of these, but you should at least be aware of it. And usually get your site coordinator involved when this is, but you should at least be aware of what an ITIN is and what it's used for. And this is used to help individuals who, and this is important, individuals who cannot get a social security number. If they can get a social security number, they have to do that first. Okay. So this is if they don't qualify to get a social security number. Then they get an ITIN, an individual taxpayer identification number, to help them comply with the US tax laws. I'll give you a couple of examples. I mean, I work in a community, or I worked in a community college. We have foreign students that would study there. They'd work somewhat, and so they're required to file a tax return, but they don't have a social security number, so they have to get an ITIN to do it. Or maybe they've even come here illegally and they're trying to get citizenship. Whether or not they're trying to get citizenship, whether or not you're here legally or illegally, if you file, if you earn money here and you have a filing requirement, you're supposed to file a tax return. Okay. But we find a lot of people who've emigrated here that are trying, they're away, they've applied for a green card, they're trying to get citizenship. They have to file their tax returns. So we get them ITINs, right? There's a few other examples to where maybe they're here on some kind of visa. They have no intention of being a citizen, but they got interest income or some other kind of income, and maybe even they won't owe any taxes on it. But if they open a bank account without a social security number, the bank requires an ITIN because they have mandatory withholding on it. So these are some of the reasons of why you would have to get an ITIN. You'll know it's an ITIN because it'll start with a 9. The number will, or the letter or card as verification. We can apply for an ITIN. Okay. First of all, if they say they need that, get the site coordinator involved. Okay. Because these can be very complicated. There's a lot of requirements that go into it. It can only be paper filed, and you really want to make sure we fill out the form accurately. Plus, there's certifying documents. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay. I maybe said some of this, but let's look at some of this here too. Yeah, the ITIN is used in place of the social security number. Okay. It doesn't entitle them to any social security benefits or the earned income tax credit. Okay. It doesn't change their immigration status. It doesn't give them the right to work. It doesn't serve as any kind of identification. It's simply to comply with the tax laws. Okay. There's some other things about ITIN that says right here, if a primary taxpayer, spouse, or both have ITINs, that's either or both, they are ineligible to receive the earned income tax credit, even if their dependents have valid social security numbers. Okay. If the taxpayer and spouse have valid social security numbers, only dependents with the social security numbers, not ITINs, qualify to receive the earned income tax credit. So that's always what, if you see ITIN, and maybe they're not even applying for an ITIN, they've already got their ITIN, they've come into the site, they've been filing returns. Be careful that you don't accidentally claim the earned income tax credit if they don't qualify for it. So here's the process, and I'm not going to go over too much of this stuff, although I want to point out something really important. Okay. You have to have documentation that substantiates their status and identity. Okay. The IRS gives you lists of documents that will satisfy one or the other. There's only one document that satisfies both, and that's a passport. And generally, that's what if they're applying for a W-7, if they're applying for an ITIN using a W-7, they're going to bring in a passport. Now, the instructions will say, mail the documentation along with Form W-7. And by the way, it has to be with the tax return. Okay. But think about this. Would you mail your passport to IRS, especially if you're here on a visa or something? Okay. Not a good idea. Okay. You could also go and present it in an IRS walk-in offices, but you need an appointment, and that can be complicated. Here's the more likely thing. You process the application through a certified acceptance agent. And that agent can then take a copy of the passport, file a form, and they can certify it or authenticate it. And then you can fill it in with file it with the copy, the certified copy. And that's usually what we're going to have them do. They could also go to their consulate. And if they're from Mexico, there's a lot of consulates there. They're from another country, they're probably going to have to go to Washington or San Francisco. It's not very practical. Okay. This is what I talked about, a certified acceptance agent, and they do charge fees. Sometimes sometimes VITA sites will have a certified acceptance agent that can do these for the taxpayers. And of course, we don't charge them money when we do that. Okay. Okay. Oh, entering personal information into TaxSlayer. I advise you, remember I told you about the 4012? My 4012 gets marked up and flagged, and the pages are falling out and blah, blah, blah. Here's one page that I flag. Okay. These are examples of how to enter the correct name that's on their Social Security cards. Since, if it says John Brown, well, that's pretty common. But I'm gonna go to the next page that's got some more things. Like, look at this. I told you a minute ago, I see Social Security cards that'll have like 5 names on them. Like, here's one with 4. Robert Garcia Garza Hernandez. Well, is Garcia, do I put G as the middle initial, or is it just Hernandez? Is it, this gives us at least some clues of how to enter in TaxSlayer. Now, that said, the best way is if they filed a return last year that was accepted, they filed it electronically, look at that tax return and put it in the way that tax return had it. Okay, so because it got accepted once, you'll know it'll get accepted again. Sometimes you'll have, some Asian names too. This will give you an example of how to put those in. Okay, we can get a drink here, and then we're going to dive into dependents slides to just kind of reinforce what I'm going to show you using the 4012. Okay, and this time I think I will go back up to the table of contents so I don't give you a headache of scrolling through it. But this is under tab C, dependents. So I'm going to go here to tab C. I'll make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. And I would encourage you, if you've got the book, open it up or have it open as a PDF in the back of the screen. So here's the overview of rules for claiming a dependent. Now, the very first thing I want to tell you as an overview is there's 2 types of dependents. There's the qualifying child, and there's the qualifying relative, who, by the way, doesn't necessarily have to be your relative. Okay, I know it's kind of odd, but the real big difference here is that if they qualify as a qualifying child, they get the child tax credit, which is well, it's 2,000, I think. I'm not sure if the new tax law bumped it to 2,200 for 25 or if that's in 26, but roughly $2,000, right? If you're a qualifying relative, you only get a $500 tax credit. Okay. Now, by the way, here's going to introduce you to what we'll cover, I think, in session 5, is about credits. This is really important because a credit is not a deduction. A credit is a dollar for dollar offset of the taxes that you owe, or it can maybe increase the refund depending on the type of credit. We'll get more into that, but I just want you to realize right now that credits are more valuable than deductions. And these are credits that we're talking about. So, what are some of these? These are rules, an overview of the rules here. Okay, and I'm going to actually go to another page before I dive into the details. Let me think here. Yeah. Okay, no, this is the page I want to be on here. So you're right. Let's look at all of these things here. You can't claim any dependents if you or your spouse could be claimed as a dependent by another taxpayer. Okay, so again, we have lots of households, right, that have 3 generations living in them, right? And if grandpa is claiming the parents as dependents, the parents can't claim their kids as dependents, right? So that would be one example. You can't claim a married person who files a joint return as a dependent, okay? In other words, your spouse is not your dependent. You can't claim a person as a dependent unless that person is a U.S. citizen, a U.S. resident alien. That basically means you've got a green card, or you elect to be treated as a resident alien. This is beyond the scope of this, but that's that. But look at these two, a U.S. national or a resident of Canada or Mexico. That's interesting because you may have dependents that you're supporting, that are down in Mexico, right? Or they're residents in Mexico and they're here in the United States, right? So that's an interesting one. Now there's some footnotes there too. Yeah, there's exceptions for certain adopted children, right? These footnotes can be very important, okay? You can't claim a person as a dependent unless that person is your qualifying child or qualifying relative. These are the 2 buckets that I'm describing here. So let's look at some of the requirements to be a qualifying child, right? Now, I warned you about relationships, right? Be certain you're looking at the relationships for this section of the tax law you're trying to interpret. In this case, dependents, right? So here it says, the child must be your child, stepchild, foster child, sibling, half sibling, step sibling, or a descendant of any of them. Okay? So, you got a child, so that could be grandchild is a descendant of it. It could be your sibling, your brother. What's a descendant of your brother? Well, that would be your niece or nephew, right? So you got to be really careful about how you're looking at it. Okay, and if you got an adopted child that was placed with you for legal adoption, that qualifies. Okay, number 2 is really important. The child must be under age 19. Now, always in the tax law, be careful of whether they say under 19 or more or older than 19. They all 3 mean different things. Okay, in this case, it says under age 19. So if they turn 19 on December 31st, right, they don't count for this one. B, now this is an or. They must be either under 19 at the end of the year or under age 24 at the end of the year, a full-time student and younger than you or your spouse. Now, full-time student is a qualifier in there you've got to look at, and usually they'll know if they're away at college for doing that. I'll discuss that in a minute. And then or, okay, this is an important one too. Any age if permanently or totally disabled. Okay, so the person can be 30 years old, and if they're permanently disabled and they meet all these other tests for you, you get that increased tax credit. You can count them as a qualifying child. Okay. Here, number 3, child must have lived with you for more than half of the year. And notice footnote 2. Okay. There are exceptions for temporary absences. Now, it doesn't define here what a temporary absence is, but in another section I'll point out when we come to it, we're going to find that a temporary absence is like if they're away at school. Maybe I live in Phoenix here, and maybe my son goes up here to northern Arizona to go to college in Flagstaff, and they're there 9 months out of the year and come back and live with me for 3 months. Actually, they could live there all year if their intent is to come back and live with me after college. That's called a temporary absence. They're considered living with me. So that's really important. Okay. Number 4, the child must not have provided more than half of his or her own support. And footnote 5 will tell you that there's a worksheet for determining that. This is important, and people will confuse this, okay? This is not saying that you had to provide more than half of their support. It's saying that they did not provide more than half their own support for the year. Okay. Then there's a couple of other obscure ones here. The child isn't filing a joint return for the year unless that is just to claim a refund. So maybe your kids got married and they're living with you now, and they file a joint return as long as it's just to claim a refund. In other words, they did not meet the filing requirements to file a return. That doesn't disqualify them from here. Now, number 6 says the child okay, oh boy, yeah, this is important. If the child meets the rules to be a qualified child of more than one person, you must be entitled to claim the child as a qualifying child. It says see qualifying child of more than one person chart. There's a chart, and we're going to go down through that in a minute, because one of your test questions will require you to look at that. Okay. What else have we got here? Okay. And so here's that chart that, well, here are tiebreaker rules, right? And this is the one I'm going to refer you to, because there's one of our test questions where you've got to kind of go look at this chart to determine the answer, right? And so it says if the child meets the conditions to be the qualifying child of more than one person, only one person can claim the child as, we'll just call it as a qualifying child dependent. Now they go on to specify it's really for all these credits, but in general, that's what we're talking about. That are they the qualifying child, or maybe they're the qualifying relative. So in these multi-generational households, maybe, mom and grandma could both claim the child. They both qualify. They meet all of those tests we just told you about, right? Then you got to go through the tiebreaker rules. I have a big warning for you. Okay. Read them all and read the footnotes. Okay. I remember on one of these test questions, yeah, I went to look this. This was a few years ago, and I stopped right here. Oh, wow. If only one of the persons is child parent, the child is treated as qualifying child of that parent. Boom, boom, I'm done. Okay, I know who gets to claim them. No. If I go down and look at here, like you can look at some of these things, right? But if no parent claims the child is treated as qualifying child of the person who had the highest AGI for the year. Okay, careful. Make sure they give you a pretty good example down here of that too, right here. So be sure to read that. So this is saying you can begin with these tables to then determine how you do it. Table 1 is saying for all dependents, right? You can answer these questions and then keep going through these here. Let me see if there's anything. Yeah, I did kind of want to point this out. Did the person live with you as a member of your household except for temporary absences for more than half the year? and it's got a little footnote right there, 2. Here's where it gives you a little bit more information about what a temporary absence is. Child is considered to have lived with you during periods of time when one of you or both are temporarily absent due to illness. Yeah, maybe they were in the hospital for, months. Education, that was the example I gave you. They're away on business at a temporary job for 7 months, but, you know, vacation, military service, institutionalized care, or for a child who's permanently and totally disabled. Oh, or incarceration, you know. Um, so I wanted to kind of point that out. Um, I think I've covered, this is just another way of going through, determining all of that. Here's the other one. Did the person provide more than half of his or her own support? It's not asking you, did you support them for more than 3, not for more than half the year. There's a footnote 3 that tells you that there's a worksheet for determining support included later in this tab. So if you're not sure, they're not sure, they can't do it. And there's a lot of things that can be things. Are they receiving Social Security benefits? Do they get welfare or, food stamps, things like that? Are those considered support? That worksheet can help you determine that. Okay, so now this is the chart for all dependents, right? Okay. Now here's one for qualifying relative dependents. That was that second bucket. Instead of being qualifying child, this is qualifying relative, right? And the first test is the person your qualifying child or the qualifying child of another taxpayer? If so, they're not your qualifying relative. They can't be both, and it's not a choice that you make, right? So it says yes, no. It says go back to table 1 and see all dependents, right? If no, go to step 2. Now it's looking at relationships, right? So you look at these relationships, right? And here it expands them a little bit. Son-in-law, daughter-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law. If no, go to step 3. Okay. If yes, go to step 4. But let's look at step 3. Was the person or any other person other than your spouse who lived with you a member of your household all year? Okay. So you get your buddy from college, right, who's lost his wife, lost his job. He's been couch surfing around. He comes and he says, hey man, can I stay on your couch for a month or so till I get back on my feet again? And a year later, bang, he's still living in your house, right? That's a qualifying relative. So, that's what I'm gonna say. Okay, so we go to step 4, right? Now, here's the one that usually disqualifies people, that for being a qualifying relative. Okay. So, this could be, we determined they're not your qualifying child. Maybe this is your parents who live with you, right? And you want to say, well, hey, can I get that $500 tax credit for claiming that? The thing that usually disqualifies them is this one. They had to have gross income of less than $5,200. Okay, but be careful. See this little footnote 3? Let me see if it says it down in here, footnote 3. For purposes of this test, I'm right here. Gross income of an individual who is permanently totally disabled doesn't include income for services the individual provides at a sheltered workshop. Gross income means all income the person received in the form of money, goods, property, and service that isn't exempt from tax. Look at the next sentence. Don't include Social Security benefits unless the person is married filing a separate return another bad idea for filing separate returns, married filing separate, and live with their spouse at any time during the year, or if half the Social Security benefits plus their other gross income and blah, blah, blah tax is more than 25,000. Okay, this we're gonna learn about how some of your Social Security benefits could be taxable. But, it's to give you a benchmark for this. Your parents live with you, they get Social Security, maybe one of them's got a part-time job, they're making a few $1,000 at it, right? Well, less than 5,200, remember? Okay, they're making $3,000. That $3,000 does not make their Social Security taxable, and they would still qualify. But if they're working and they make more than $5,200, right, this is usually what disqualifies them. The point I'm trying to say is you probably don't count their Social Security. If their Social Security is taxable, they're not going to qualify. Okay, now here's a different one. Did you provide more than half of this person's total support for the year? Of course, if they're living with you, and they made less than 5,200, chances are that yes, you have, right? But again, you could see the worksheet for determining that support. Okay. Did another person provide more than half of this person's total support? If yes, you can't claim the person. If there's two or more people who could take the dependent, you've got to look at these rules. These are rare. You're not going to look at most of these things here. Okay, so that's the qualifying relative, right? Now we've got a whole nother table 3. A couple of those things in there refer you to this table 3. Children of divorced or separated parents who live apart. Okay, I'm going to summarize this table for you because it's got a lot of dates and a lot of things in here, but let me summarize for you what this really means, right? What's really important, the first question to really determine is who did the child live with more than half of the year? Okay, that's called the custodial parent. And in general, the custodial parent by default is entitled to claim that person as a qualifying child, unless the custodial parent releases the exemption, they call it. And they have to sign this form 8332, that releases the exemption. Okay, we used to have this term called exemption, and it's still in here for now, but it's really releasing the claim to claim the child as a dependent. Now, there's some exceptions, and I don't think I'm going to bore you with a lot of the exceptions because most of them they're applying if the taxpayer has a post 1984 and a pre 2009 decree or agreement. Now think about this for a second. 2009 to 2025 now. What are we at? We're already at 16, 17 years, and that's if it's at the end. If it's 84, we're talking like 40 years, right? Most of these, this is really talking about children. Okay, none of this stuff is going to apply. And if it applies, the taxpayer is going to know. There's some rare exceptions to where we could attach a decree. That's like if it's pre-1985, and I think the child would have to be disabled. It's just so rare. I don't want to confuse you with this. What I want to make you aware is if you've got a taxpayer says, oh yeah, I've always claimed this person, and no, I never had to file this form 8332, get the site coordinator involved. Let's just make sure we're doing this right. Okay? And I'll leave it to you to read through this if you're curious, but I kind of wanted to do it. Here's that worksheet for determining support. Okay? It's kind of complicated, but these are kind of the things I would review. Don't include the following items in total taxpayer support. Social Security, no. Life insurance premium, funeral expense, scholarships received by your child if your child is a student. That could be a big one. Here it talks about Social Security benefits, and TAMF is food stamps, right? Uh, Temporary assistance to needy families, foster care payments, so or tax exempt income. If you're not sure, read this. Generally, it's pretty clear cut. Okay, it's not, you know, I've rarely ever had to go fill out that worksheet. Okay, I think I'm done with going through. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to stop sharing the 4012 and let's go back and just review our presentation again. And this will kind of help solidify some of this stuff, right? So as I said, there's two buckets. You're either a qualifying child or a qualifying relative, right? Um, you could get a $500 credit if they're not the qualifying child, if they're a qualifying relative. So that's the other thing. Qualifying children cannot be claimed by another taxpayer. Only one person gets to do it. Okay, I've kind of talked about that. So all dependents cannot claim another dependent, right? If they're your dependent, they can't claim somebody else. They can't file a joint return unless it's simply to get a refund of taxes withheld. They got to be citizen or residency. And here's kind of a summary of child versus relative. And the big thing to remember here is, you know, the relationships, the qualified relationships, go look at that chart under table 2 because it expands the blood relatives, but then it also says if they're a member of your house all year, even though they're not a relative, right? They're considered your relative, I guess. That's rare. You're not likely to see that most of the time, but it's possible. The big thing is gross income has to be less than 5,200. Okay. Um, these I've already kind of described these. Um, they can't be claimed by a dependent by another person. They can't file a joint return. They have to be a citizen of, and this is different. You know, it could be Canada or Mexico, U.S., Canada, or Mexico. Okay. This is interesting because we'll see this. You know, somebody comes in, they've been hosting a foreign exchange student. Hey, lived with them all year, right? They cannot be claimed as dependents, foreign exchange students. Okay. A resident alien, uh, this could get a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try to simplify this somewhat. You're a resident alien if you either meet the green card test or the substantial presence test. So green card test, if you got a green card, you're called a resident alien, okay? The substantial presence test is if you stayed here for a period of time. Now, there's exceptions to this test, and this is where we get into helping foreign students, because the foreign students that are here under certain types of visas, they can exclude days of presence. And in fact, they have to file a form to document the exclusion of those days. And that's where we help them. But you have to get certified under that foreign student test to be able to help them do that. Now, why is this important? Because if they're considered a resident alien, they have to claim all their worldwide income on their US tax return. That's pretty important. But that just kind of summarizes it for you. I think there's a couple of slides here in this, it actually gets more complicated than this, but it gives you an idea of what this substantial presence test is. First of all, unless you've got several years of experience of doing this, if you come across something like this, get the site coordinator involved. But basically, you know, they had to have stayed here more than half the year um, during the 3-year period that includes the current year and 2 years immediately before, blah, blah, blah. Except, like if you're a student, you can exclude some of those days. but only for so many years too. Can't do it forever. Okay, qualifying child dependency test, right? Remember the relationship, and I talked about being a descendant of any of them. So be careful. You've got your son, daughter, stepchild. The example I gave was, hey, you got your brother or sister, or any descendant of any of them. That means your nieces or nephews count for this too, right? Age under 19 and younger than the taxpayer. It's kind of weird. I've never really run across that to where, nevertheless. Um, but under age 24, remember this is under age 24 at the end of the year. Full-time student, how do you know they're full-time? Okay, well, sometimes they'll get this form called a 1098-T, and actually that doesn't tell them full-time. There's a definition, and I think in your 4012 it'll say it's a very liberal definition of it. It says you have to be enrolled at least half-time for one full semester of the year. Now, generally, that means 6 credit hours, semester hours, if they're that. And that generally means 2 classes. So you take 2 classes in a semester in the year and you're full-time. Pretty liberal definition. That Form 1098-T will have a little box check that says they were at least half-time, okay, in one of the semesters. And that lets you know that they qualify under this thing here. Residency test, lived with the taxpayer more than half the year. The child can't have provided more than half of his or her own support. You know, there are times where if you want the dependent to fail, you know, you want to have them claim themselves, right? There's ways that you could fail this test, right? For instance, maybe you're sending your son or daughter money. If you send them money through Venmo, that's a gift, right? And then now it's their money, and if they pay their rent with that money, well, they're providing more than half their support. So, you know, maybe you could then say that they're providing more than half their support, and then they could file their own return, claim their own education credits or whatever have you. On the other hand, if you're Venmoing their landlord to pay their rent, well, you're providing their support. So kind of think about those kinds of things there. Qualifying relative, the first test is they can't be your qualifying child. You got to first go through those tests there, okay? Member of household or relationship test, right? Remember, the relatives are kind of expanded here, right? Related by blood. I showed you how they were expanded in the 4012. Or they don't really have to be your relative if they lived with you the entire year. So those are those kind of tests. Gross income, this is what I said is one of the most important. This is usually where they'll fail, is if they've got gross income for the year that's $5,200 or more, they fail. They can't be your qualifying relative. And then this is different than the first one. This is saying you had to provide more than half of their support. The first test is the child couldn't have provided more than half of their own support. This is saying if they're going to be your qualifying relative, you had to provide more than half of their support. Now, something I didn't say, it just struck me in here too. Maybe you're supporting your parents and they're in a nursing home. Okay. Now, so that, and I kind of did, I brushed over it, I guess, but you could claim them because that's almost like a temporary absence for doing it. That's as if they lived. As long as you're paying for it, you've got to provide more than half of their support. Again, we talked about these relatives here. Could do it. Okay. So children of divorced or separated parents, who can claim them? You know, you got to figure out who provides more than half the support, but this is the real important one. Okay. And folks will come in and say, well, I've got a divorce decree that says I get to claim them, right? Judge said, I get them, right? Well, but then you quiz them and you find out that the kids lived with mom more than half the year. Well, they can't claim them unless mom signs this release. IRS doesn't care what the judge said. I know that sounds kind of funny, right? But IRS says, well, no, if the judge said you get to claim them, then you go back to the judge and you have the judge force mom to sign this release of claim. And by the way, the release of claim can be for multiple years. But IRS is saying, we're not getting in the middle of your divorce dispute. If you think you're entitled to it, you go back to the judge and you have the judge force the custodial parent to release the exemption. Okay? That's kind of the summary of that right there too. Of course, be careful. It could be quite possible that it could be the qualifying child of more than one person. Be sure you read the rules about this. You can't split it up, split these credits and say, well, okay, well, let's let them claim them to be able to get head of household, but we're going to let grandma get the child tax credit because she's got more taxes to offset or whatever reason. It's one or the other. Either you get all of these benefits or you get none of them. Okay. I showed you that chart about special rules for divorced or separated parents. I showed you the worksheet for determining support if you need to use it. Here is a TaxSlayer screen. I won't go over this in TaxSlayer yet. We'll open up TaxSlayer in the next section and we'll kind of go over this. But you've got I already talked about these questions that are in there. And here you define the relationship. You say how many months that they lived with you, and like here's a common checkbox. Check if this person was over age 18 and a full-time student at an eligible education institution, right? So if you're claiming a kid, that's over 18, you want to check that box, right? I will go over these things when we go into TaxSlayer too. I've really talked about this screen, general rules of children of divorced or separated parents. It's really important. The custodial parent has the first right. Not even if the non-custodial parent is paying all the expenses and blah, 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 right? This is interesting. If the child received over half of their support from a third party, neither parent can claim the child is a dependent. Okay. I guess that's possible. Grandma's paying all the support or they're getting federal assistance. This is rare, but it's possible. Okay. I've already talked about the custodial parent has to sign that form 8332, and then that statement's got to be attached to the non-custodial parent's return. So if we're preparing a return for a non-custodial parent and he or she tells us that the child didn't live with them for more than 6 months, we have to have this form to file the return. And I think you can still file it electronically. You've just got to answer the questions and certify that you've got it. I'm not sure. I don't really recall. These were all and as I said, this is so moot now. I mean, you're not likely to see it because it's been so long since these rules went into effect. There was a transition period to where you could attach the divorce decree. Okay. As I said, that's so unlikely to be here now that you're going to do it. But so here's the main thing. For any divorce decree executed after 2008, the Form 8332 is mandatory. That's why I'm saying most of this other stuff is moot. So this is a child, we're now in 25, 17 years later, right? You're not likely to have a child that, had a divorce decree that was executed before 2008 claiming that child. You don't have to remember all these rules. You've got to know where to find them. That's the important thing. And in fact, I'm going to tell you another thing about these tests that you're taking. I'm not going to claim they're simple questions. They're not. I've been doing this 35 years. I just took these tests and I had to go look up several of these answers. A, you don't remember them from year to year. B, more importantly, they change year to year, right? C, some of these rules are pretty complex about dependents and filing statuses. And so I've got to go double check. The whole purpose of the test is not to see if you've memorized and become the A1 tax expert for doing it. It's, can you recognize what you don't know and know where to go look it up? That's really what this test is all about. Okay. So um, there's nothing in this rule that says you can't call one of your friends and ask them. You've got to learn to use the resources for doing it. There's another resource that I'll point out here, and I'll come back to this later on. It's the Colorado Resource Toolbox. You can Google this, and they've got lots of little tools on the next page right here, like dependent qualification calculator, where it'll walk you through some questions that you could do it. Education benefits calculator you're going to find. So I would explore this. Okay. Again, it's another resource to put in your toolbox. Here's a few practice tips. I kind of said, taxpayer may be able to claim a child or family member who lives in Mexico. Okay. Taxpayer may be able to claim a parent who lives in a retirement home. Okay. Taxpayer may be able to claim an adult child if the child still lives at home. And here's a typo. It increased to 5,200 this year. Thought I fixed all those, but. So let's go through and look at some of the examples and see if we can apply this. And as we do this, open up your 4012 and see if you can kind of determine how you would answer this. So the first one here, Dave and Tanya live together, but they are not married. Tanya's son, baby Zeke, lives with them. Dave is not baby Zeke's father. Tanya made no money last year and is not required to file a tax return. Who can claim baby Zeke? So open up your 4012, put this on pause, and go through and see if you can determine who can claim baby Zeke. And the answer is because Tanya is not required to file a tax return, Dave may claim baby Zeke as his qualifying relative, not child. Okay. He also might be able to claim Tanya as a qualifying relative as well. But again, if you go through the rules, the different rules between qualifying child and qualifying relative, you'll see that they could only both qualify as that. Let's try another one. So Marie, she's 18, she earned $5,000. Her father provided more than half of her support. If all other dependency tests are met, can her father claim her as a dependent? So put this on pause, look at your 4012. This one's not very difficult. I think you'll get to this. It says, because Maria is under 19, we use the qualifying child rules so that the gross income test does not even apply. If she's 18, if she's under 19, there is no income thing for a qualifying child. Okay, so her father can claim her as a dependent. Okay, let's change gears now, and we'll look at some Arizona specifics as they pertain to dependency exemptions. So this is a screenshot from TaxSlayer when you're in the Arizona return in the basic information screen. The first thing we want to look at is it possible that they have a qualifying parent or ancestor? That's kind of how Arizona calls it. And we'll look at the rules for that, but this is where you would go in to enter them in as a qualifying parent or ancestor. So look at the rules here. To be a qualifying parent or ancestor, they must be the parent or grandparent of the taxpayer or spouse. They have to be 65 or older in 2024. Actually, that's 2025 now. Okay. They must live in the principal residence, the taxpayer's principal residence for the entire year. And they also have to be a qualified dependent on the federal return. Okay, so if you remember, what would be the rules there? They can't make more than $5,200. They had to live with them. They couldn't have provided more than 50% of their own support, right? Does that all sound familiar? But then additionally, and they had to have required assistance with 2 or more activities of daily living. Now, these are pretty broad. Okay, here's an example of what they are. Do they need help getting dressed? Do they need help eating, ambulating, toileting? Do you have to help them with their medication or do shopping for them? So you see how this works out. I mean, if you've got an elderly parent there, it could be quite possible that you're providing 2 or more of those. So why does this really matter? Because if you see a parent or grandparent on the taxpayer's return, be sure to determine if they may be a qualifying parent or ancestor. That may take a little bit of finesse. I mean, but you by now you built a rapport with the taxpayer, and you say, I see you're taking care of your mom. Is that does she pretty much take care of herself, or? And, taxpayer may say, well, kind of, but yeah, I got to do her shopping for her and help her with things. She did blah, blah, blah. You can find out by doing that. The benefit is they get an additional exemption on the Arizona return of $10,000, meaning that's a deduction that they get off of their gross income. And in Arizona here, we have a 2% flat Arizona tax rate. So if they do qualify for this, it would be worth $200 to the taxpayer. So that covered our discussion on dependents and Arizona specifics on dependents. So when we pick back up with session 2C, we're then going to start into income and start talking about the various aspects of income. So with that, until next time, I look forward to seeing you again. Okay, bye-bye.